What's up, everybody? It is I, TevinElChopo, friends call me Chop, and we are back with another review. This time we are talking about DC's animated films for Watchmen chapters 1 and 2. So Watchmen chapters 1 and 2 are a two-part movie series that came out in 2024 based on the graphic novel Watchmen, created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons in 1986. So the Watchmen graphic novel essentially takes place in an alternate 1985 in which a group of retired and outlawed superheroes band together to essentially solve the murder mystery of one of their own, known as the Comedian. Now, with this happening, there's also a looming threat of a nuclear arms race happening with America and other countries. Very reminiscent to the American fears of a World War III that were happening in the country around the mid-1980s. And the original graphic novel does a great job of intertwining not only the murder mystery aspect, but the aspect of the potential World War III that's going on in the background, and also just the incorporations of superheroes in society at that specific time. I bring all these things up because the animated films chapters 1 and 2 are essentially a literal adaptation of the book, pretty much. There are slight deviations in terms of how the narrative is structured, but in terms of the actual story itself, it is a pretty literal retelling of the entire graphic novel from beginning to end. Now, some of the things that I did in fact like the animation style. I think that it was pretty solid. It's very reminiscent to a lot of the other types of animated projects that DC have been coming out with lately. I also enjoy the voice acting, with specifically Titus Welliver playing Rorschach, which I did not realize that was him. I only know Titus Welliver for playing Bosch in the TV show Bosch, which I consider to be probably the most boringest cop show ever made. But he did a great job to the point where I was very much surprised to even see that was actually him voicing him. I also want to give a shout out to Troy Baker, who plays Ozymandias in both films, as he is a voice acting legend. But overall, I think that everyone did a good job with interpreting their characters throughout both movies. Another thing that I enjoyed is that it is a literal adaptation of the Watchmen graphic novel. Personally, I have been a fan of the graphic novel since I was a child. I actually had my mother buy me a copy of the book when I was way too young to even understand any of the themes. This had to have been at least 4 or 5 years before Zack Snyder came out with his adaptation of Watchmen. So I'm definitely familiar with the source material, and I can appreciate it being essentially a literal adaptation. It does take a few liberties with how the narrative is structured, just for the sake of incorporating the Tales of the Black Freighter, which is essentially a comic book that explores a lot more of the themes, a lot deeper of the overarching narrative of the graphic novel. Basically a comic within a comic in a sense. But other than that, it is truly faithful to the source material. Now, with that being said, I have to admit that while I enjoyed it for being a literal adaptation, I must admit that it is also kind of the detriment of both films, chapters 1 and 2 as well. Because as I was watching both films, I couldn't help but think to myself, who are these movies really for exactly? Essentially, Watchmen, the graphic novel, has been out for roughly 40 years now. Zack Snyder's adaptation came out in 2009, and we've had 2 sequel adaptations come out in the last 10 years or so, not including the motion comic that was created for Watchmen that is more faithful to the original art style. I just don't see a world where these Watchmen movies really have a place for anyone who hasn't already seen Watchmen at this point, or anyone who's already a fan of the original material. A few more minor gripes that I also have on top of that are that, for one, I think that the pacing is a little off, especially with it being cut into 2 separate movies. I can appreciate them being more thorough than Zack Snyder was able to do in a theatrical cut of the Watchmen in 2009 by creating 2 separate movies and essentially giving the source material time to breathe. But at the same time, it can also be somewhat boring, to be honest with you, to sit through both movies. Because again, I'm very familiar with the source material, so it's not like I'm seeing anything different or that it's playing out any differently than it did in the graphic novel. So I essentially know this beat for beat to the point where I don't feel like I need to watch a whole 2-part movie series about it. Another minor gripe that I have is that I felt like while the voice acting was good, it felt like at times that they were reading lines in a sense, especially in chapter 1 more than anything. Like, some of the line delivery was just a little too fast and unfeeling for me, almost as if they were reading it for the sake of getting it done, but not necessarily reading it for the sake of what it means for the tension of the scene, if that makes sense. Like, voice acting is still acting, but there were times where it still felt like it was more so line reading than it was acting, if that makes sense. And again, this is more towards chapter 1 than it was for chapter 2, in my opinion. I think that it got a lot better in terms of letting more brevity into the lines happen in chapter 2, but it is something that I noticed, and it may have just been me. Also, another gripe that I had that is kind of a double-edged sword is that as much as I appreciate them incorporating the Tales of the Black Freighter into the overall narrative in the best way that they possibly could, given the medium that they're using to retell the story, I kind of found it to be a little distracting from the narrative itself, and also part of why I felt like the pacing was off throughout the film. And this is the part where I'm going to go ahead and throw a spoiler alert into the video. Now, if you haven't seen these movies or read the original Watchmen comic or watched Zack Snyder's film, or you just literally just don't know anything about Watchmen itself and you want to stay in that lane and watch these things for yourself, I'm going ahead and put a spoiler warning here now. Feel free to click off the video and come back if you feel like you need to be reacquainted with the actual material. So when I say that the pacing was off with the Tales of the Black Freighter, I do mean that. And also, it was just certain moments where the comic within the comic of Tales of the Black Freighter was incorporated in such a way that it kind of reveals some of the twists throughout the movie, if that makes sense. Like, again, spoiler alert, Ozymandias is the one who killed the comedian and essentially is the one orchestrating all the things that led to the apocalyptic event at the very end of the movie, the second part, chapter 2 movie. And there's one particular scene where he is essentially faking his own assassination attempt by hiring someone to try to kill him, essentially. And he essentially puts a cyanide capsule into his mouth so that he can essentially not tell anyone that he was hired by Ozymandias to, you know, fake the assassination attempt. Now, when this happens in the original graphic novel and even in Zack Snyder's adaptation, it is pretty straightforward. But in this animated adaptation, they included the narration of Tales from the Black Freighter within that sequence. And because they did that, it felt like more of a clear giveaway that he was the essential antagonist of the film, especially with the parts of the Black Freighter narrative that they incorporated into that scene specifically, kind of making it a lot more obvious for me, which again was bringing it back to my original point of me not knowing who this adaptation is for specifically, because I know Ozymandias is the one who is orchestrating all these things, because I'm already familiar with the source material and the previous adaptations of the source material. But if I was coming into this blind and the Tales of the Black Freighter narration was over that specific scene with Ozymandias, I would definitely think that he was the bad guy off a rip. I also don't think that a lot of the core themes were properly represented in these films either. So essentially, Watchmen was a critique of superheroes within the comic book genre specifically. So when you take the story outside of the comic book medium, it definitely comes off as a more watered down version of a lot of the themes and core ideologies that the original graphic novel had. And I know that's also an issue that a lot of people had with the Zack Snyder adaptation in 2009, because when you take the story outside of its initial medium, it just doesn't work to the same effectiveness in terms of critiquing these characters, critiquing the themes of what these characters symbolize. And it comes off more as a glorification of a lot of the things that the original source material was trying to critique. And as a quick sidebar, I just want to run through my quick thoughts on really every adaptation of Watchmen that I know of anyway. Of course, we have the original source material, the 1986 graphic novel written by Alan Moore. So anyone who knows the source material heavily knows the story behind Alan Moore selling the rights to Watchmen to DC. I'm not here to get into that specifically because as far as I'm concerned at this point, I think both sides were wrong. In my opinion, if Alan Moore really cherished this story or cherished these characters that he developed, he would have held on to them a lot longer or for a lot more compensation. And I also think that DC is wrong for constantly making adaptations of Watchmen, even though it does not necessarily need any more adaptations. So I can't really say that there's any victims on either side, in my humble opinion. Feel free to tell me how I'm wrong in the comments. So yeah, the original graphic novel is in fact a classic in my eyes. It's definitely a critique on just superheroes, superhero culture, comic book culture as well. And it definitely does a great job of just humanizing what these people would really look like if we really had superheroes in our reality. All the superheroes in this universe are flawed individuals. Even when you have characters like Dr. Manhattan, the only superhero who has actual superpowers, he's not only flawed before he got the superpowers, but he's also proven to be flawed after the fact as well. So I think that the original medium does a great job of telling the story the way it needs to be told. Also just giving us characters that are a lot more human than we would even like to see at times, and just being a deep dive in a lot of the things that were wrong with comic book culture at the time. Next, you have the 2009 Watchmen movie by Zack Snyder. I think that revisionist history has been very kind to this movie in the years since. I vividly remember going to the movie theater the week it came out to see it and nobody liking that movie but me. But now with so many years that have gone by and just different cuts of the movie coming out, whether it be the director's cut or even the ultimate cut that came out, time has been a lot more flattering towards the opinions of this movie. Personally, I think that this is a fine adaptation. I think that there are certain liberties that Zack Snyder takes that I don't particularly care for in my older age, realizing what they are now. His adaptation does change a few things, specifically with the ending as well. Personally, I don't have an issue with the changes that he made with the ending per se. Now, what I will say is that while I do think that it is a pretty literal adaptation of the source material, it's literal in the most surface level ways possible. I think looking back at the movie now, Zack Snyder did not do a great job of diving deep into the subtext of what Watchmen is actually about. I'm sure there have been plenty of YouTube videos and think pieces where people have dived deep into these things a lot deeper than I'm willing to do right here in this video. But overall, it is a fine adaptation. Not the best in the world, but it is fairly serviceable. Then you have the Watchmen motion comic series that DC produced many years back. In my opinion, I think that this is the best adaptation of Watchmen aside from the original source material, mainly because it is essentially the source material but in motion. So you are able to follow everything in the most literal sense possible. I think that the voice actor that they hired to play the characters did a great job as well. The music that they incorporated to add tension was solid. And because it's literally the graphic novel but in motion, you essentially get the gist of every single thing that the graphic novel was trying to do. Then you have the comic book sequel, which is Doomsday Clock, that came out in 2017. It's essentially what if the Watchmen characters were in the DC universe with Superman and Batman. I think that this adaptation is not good at all, in my humble opinion. I think that it was a clear cash grab for DC to just make money off of these characters yet again. It doesn't say or do anything that is particularly interesting or relevant or pertinent to the previous points that were made in the original adaptations or the original source material. Again, it just feels like DC did it for the sake of making money off the characters yet again. Like, to the point where I have literally no interest in even explaining the plot. Just know that it just wasn't good, and that at some point Dr. Manhattan meets Superman and they fight for a little bit. It's just dumb. It was all dumb. Again, it's just money. DC just wanted money. That's it. Then you have the 2019 Watchmen miniseries that was created by Damon Lindelof, starring Regina King. Personally, I think this is the best Watchmen sequel that we will ever get anytime soon. I know that a lot of people did not like the show, specifically white comic book fans. The show mainly picks up after the graphic novel and tells the story of a new class of superheroes working within the police force. It also brings back a lot of the original characters who were in the original source material. I think the show is mainly different from the graphic novel in the sense that a lot of the themes are more focused on racism in America than they are about superhero culture per se. So essentially it uses the Watchmen universe to tell a story on racism in America. I think as a black man, I found it to be pretty poignant. I thought it was very interesting. I thought everyone did a great job in the show, acting wise, producing wise. It was shot very well. Again, I can understand if you are a diehard Watchmen fan, especially if you are not of color, why you would not like or vibe with the show at all. But for me, I found it very enjoyable and a pretty good sequel to the original Watchmen source material, as long as they don't make a second season. I think it was perfectly fine as a one season thing, but we'll see if DC wants money again. That'll probably define whether or not we get another season, but hopefully they were respected enough to leave it as its own thing that is isolated and will not try to make another Watchmen sequel ever again. And then there was a Watchmen video game that I recall vaguely that pretty much followed Night Owl and Rorschach. It was kind of like a prequel to the actual graphic novel. I mean, I barely played it a little bit, but personally, I don't have too much experience with that. I just know more so that it exists more than anything. If there are any fans of that video game, let me know in the comments of how you felt about that, but it does exist as well. And now we have these two-part movies, chapters 1 and 2, where again, I just don't particularly find any real reason for it to exist. If you're already a fan of Watchmen, I don't feel like there's any real need to watch this adaptation. You can just as easily just pick up the original graphic novel or just watch the motion comic. I'm pretty sure it's been on YouTube for like 10 years. And if you don't want to watch it on YouTube, it's also on Max. If you are new to Watchmen, I think that this is a solid enough approach to the material that you will get everything out of it for the most part. I would still highly suggest that you just go ahead and pick up the graphic novel. Like, it's been out for 40 years now. You can pretty much get a copy anywhere. Or you could just watch the motion comic, which, like I said, I'm pretty sure is on YouTube for free. So yeah, this one is kind of a conundrum. As much as I enjoy these movies because it's essentially a retelling of a story that I already enjoyed, I just don't see myself coming back to watch this ever. Like I said, it doesn't do or say anything differently than any other adaptation of Watchmen up to this point. It's pretty literal in enough places that I feel like the original graphic novel and the motion comic will tell the story a lot better because you get to experience more of the original artwork from those books. And I just feel like the pacing of it being divided into 2 movies just isn't enough for me to feel like I want to sit through 3 hours of this, especially when you consider that the motion comic, I'm pretty sure, is also 3 hours long or so. So yeah, I don't really think that these really need to exist or say or do anything so much differently that they stand out in any real capacity. So maybe watching these movies once out of pure curiosity may be best for you, but like I said, there are so many other ways that you can take on this material that I feel like will be just as good, if not better, than watching these 2 movies, in my opinion. And like I said, these are all just my opinions. Have you seen Watchmen chapters 1 and 2? Let me know in the comments below what you think of these movies. Also, if you have any suggestions on anything else we should talk about here on the channel, let me know in the comments below as well. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. My name is TevinElChopo. Friends call me Chop, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.